Well, it's my lot in life to pick up at sad points, so I'm next on. I'm going to try to actually pick up right where Alan left off. Go through a lot of slides and quickly, because I want to give the framework. We can talk about any particular slides or questions during the discussion period. This was a version, slightly longer version of this, actually will be up on our website tomorrow. The presentation I made to business and government leaders earlier this week, so you can go back to that. But I'll pick up and describe the dramatic decline in tax revenues that Alan talked about. And you can see the 20.9 billion down to 18.3 billion in 1 year. And then, even with the sales tax increase, we're still lagging by 11 and even to 12 where we were in 08. 3 points here. Between fiscal 8 and 10, the state experienced the largest ever 2-year decline in tax collections. Baseline revenues declining nearly 16%. And even with the sales tax increase down 11%, and presuming fiscal 2012 revenues grow by 5%, the 20 billion would still be about 800 million below 2008. So this is an historic loss of tax revenues. Capital gains is a key piece of this. If you look at the collapse of the tax revenues, 2 parts, roughly 50-50 distribution. Think about the income and sales taxes. Personal income tax and sales taxes are generally tied to people working and purchasing goods and services. The collapse of the economy accounted for about 1.6 billion of the tax reduction. And then capital gains taxes accounted for the other half. Now, essentially that's the stock market. So what happened in the last decade leading up to this recession, coming out of the previous recession, as you can see dramatically in this slide, is that we built spending increases around a vanishing revenue source. Literally. Only question was, when would it vanish and how much? Well, here's your answer. It totally collapsed in 2009, and as a result, the economic recession, if you think about it in terms of translating that to the, if I'm not talking loud enough, let me know. Translating the economic recession to the fiscal crisis, it essentially doubled the impact because of the collapse of capital gains and the stock market. Now, one of the things that happened last year, the governor proposed this, the legislature went along, there's been no attention paid to it, but in terms of future finances for the state of Massachusetts, when we ever get to a point of surplus and better times, we are placing in statute a limit of $1 billion on the use of capital gains tax revenues, and the rest will go into our stabilization or rainy day funds. That will have the impact, if the legislature, future legislatures and governors adhere to that, that will have the impact of changing, of moderating dramatically the ups and downs of state spending. I mean, now if you graph it, it's like this. Through this change, if they adhere to it, it'll be much more moderate, because one is you won't build up the spending base on a revenue source that's going to collapse, and 2, you'll put that extra money aside in a rainy day fund, like a savings account, that you can use for the next recession. So this is an important and constructive change that's received virtually no attention. State spending, Leslie will talk about this and elaborate on it. State spending does not change as dramatically as revenues. The principal reason is you have built-in cost increases in the Medicaid program for low income and seniors and disabled, their health care, capital spending, the debt service, pensions, and so forth. You have built-in spending increases that are largely obligatory that account for almost half of the budget. So the fact that you can hold spending roughly level, and I predict by 2012, when the year ends, The actual spending in 2012 will be no more than 2008. That will be the far and away the most severe fiscal crisis and spending restraint in the history of Massachusetts. It will vastly exceed what has happened in earlier fiscal crises. And we're going to have to hold fiscal spending to that, 12 spending to that level, as I'll describe in a moment. This is a summary. I want to focus on the spending cuts across all of state government during the 09 to 11 period in the right column. It's interesting, as you see, almost $2 billion of spending cuts, but then Medicaid, employee and retiree health care and pensions growing. So total spending not obviously reflecting the major spending cuts, but those spending cuts are real. And obviously what's happening, as I'll demonstrate in a minute, is a change within the budget, more and more money going to health care. Not health care reform that was passed in 06, but Medicaid in particular. So here's the 2002 state spending. Healthcare occupying 21% of the budget. 2010, 34%. It's almost all Medicaid growth. Very little of that's the health reform. And then the rest of the budget is, you look at local aid went from 7% to 3%, so forth. So a redistribution, if you will, of state spending over a 10-year period. Now, how have we managed to get through the fiscal crisis over these 3 years and keep spending all these cuts, but total spending down marginally, but roughly level? Huge dependence on one-time funds. So in 09, 3.1, 10, 2.5. Original budget in 11 is 1.6 billion of one-time money. When we say 2011 with federal aid, Congress has recently enhanced the federal stimulus, added to it for 2011. We got another chunk of money, about $667 million, and that is in the end going to be largely spent and built into the 2011 budget. So therefore, the number probably will be above $2 billion of one-time money in 2011. So on the one hand, this has saved us. The cuts have been dramatic, but they would be vastly more serious. On the other hand, and here's the basic point that I want to emphasize, as we'll look at that in a minute, despite the economic recovery and job growth, and despite the fact that we've been through 3 tough years of budget cuts, 2012 is going to be the worst of the 4 years. The worst. And that is because there will be no more one-time money. So we'll show you the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. The rainy day fund has been largely depleted. We have to keep something like $500 million in the fund, preserve our credit rating, and also for true emergencies. So there's very little we can draw on more there. Federal stimulus money ends with fiscal 2011. So this is the picture for 2012. The one-time funds in the budget, the original budget, and then with the federal aid I described, the 1.6 or 2.3. The spending on the obligatory accounts, this is essentially required additional spending, does not account for inflationary increases across most of the budget, about $1.4 billion. Revenue growth of 5%, let's say, $1 billion. No money in the stabilization, no federal stimulus. So we start fiscal 2012, the next governor, whether it's Patrick or Baker, I don't think it'll be Cahill, will face this picture. And his budget, since there are no one-time monies, there's no talk of tax increases, will face cutting of more than $2 billion in one budget year on top of the cuts that have already taken place. So this summarizes that with the continued growth of Medicaid and virtually no more one-time funds, that the overall spending is likely to actually go down from fiscal 11, and as I said, will be the most challenging year of all. Now, so far, that's the good news. We get to vote on November 2nd
Yes.
to reduce taxes. There are two proposals on the ballot. The first of the big one is to reduce the sales tax from 6.25 to 3%. An annual loss of $2.5 billion. Second, repeal the sales tax on alcoholic beverages that was approved last year, an annual loss of $100 million. Both would take effect next January 1 as laws and would immediately have to be implemented. Revenue loss from question 3, which is the sales tax reduction, $1 billion in 11 and 2.5, as I say, in 12. So then you just simply, the earlier slide, we just added to the gap simply, and you get a total gap of 4.5 to 5 billion. I mean, this is insanity. So,
Question, what's the current budget overall for the state?
I'll get right to that, Chris, in the next slide. So, with the depleted stabilization fund and no federal stimulus aid, obligatory spending on 5 major accounts I'll describe in a minute, the bottom line is that would require across the board 30% cuts in local aid, higher education, human services, public safety, all of the so-called discretionary accounts in the budget. To Chris's question, here is the sort of our analysis of the so-called mandated spending. Most of the Medicaid program, most of the Chapter 70 education aid for local schools, debt service, depending on the sales tax, and then a secondary support for the MBTA, and then the school building authority. So $15 billion out of the budget, total budget about $32 billion. So then if you look at the, if the shortfall is 4.5, then it's 28.4% across the board cuts. And if it's the shortfall is 5.2 billion, 33%. So a staggering number of size of the cuts. So needless to say, an utterly irresponsible, this summarizes, this will be on the website, all of the items in the budget that was cut by 30%. I mean, it's basically what state government does. I mean, that's fundamentally what state government does. The public assumes that state government has a lot of waste and inefficiencies and so forth in it. That's largely just a total falsehood. Most of the money goes directly to services of one sort or another, or pass-throughs from the state to local aid. $5 billion goes to cities and towns, either as general municipal aid or education aid. When you're talking about cuts at all, certainly cuts of this magnitude, you're talking about cuts that change the face of state government as we have known it for at least 5 decades. Let me say a word about the politics and what's happening. I find it utterly amazing that with this picture, and I haven't heard anybody disagree with this picture. I mean, I wish they did, and because the consequences are so serious. But I haven't, so nobody really disagrees. You might call there's a budget gap, $2 billion, 2.5 next year, whatever. But nobody disagrees. And so what's the debate, the gubernatorial debate about? Cutting taxes. That's the debate, is about cutting taxes. Now, I've been in and around government and politics a long time, and so I'm used to campaigns and sophistry. But I have to say, in all my years, the disconnect between the picture I've laid out and the campaign is as great as anything I can remember. So you have candidates saying, well, no, they don't agree with the sales tax, question 3, because that's $2.5 billion. So there's a little sanity in there. So all 3 candidates saying, no, that we can't do that. But 2 of the candidates are talking about bringing the sales tax back to 5%. It was at 5 a year ago and raised to 6.25. Proposal goes all the way to 3. So they say go back to 5%. One of the candidates talks about 5.55, 5% sales tax, 5% income tax, 5% corporate taxes. Total price tag on that is $2.5 billion, the same price tag as question 3. Another candidate comes close to that and talks about the income and sales tax going to 5%. So that's the debate, and then it talks about reforms. Now, we are at the foundation and others pushing for reforms, for example, in municipal health care, because there's huge savings to be realized by giving municipal authorities the power over to design their health plan, the same power that the state has. Preserve a very good plan. We're not talking about a race to the bottom. But in that case, only one of the candidates supports the reform. 2 others oppose that. It's absolutely a lifesaver for these cities and towns. But even an exaggerated estimate of the savings in reforms in 2012 would be $500 million. Outside, $500 million, and that would be incredibly ambitious against a gap, even if question 3 fails, of let's say $2 billion. So anyway you come at it, this is not comprehensible. So the picture will change. Whoever's governor, and policy advice to the governor, whoever's governor is going to have to face this reality. And unfortunately, all of the debate, I mean, it's legitimate to ask. I'll close on this, it seems to me. If you have the consequences of cuts that are going to be this, then should we at least discuss revenues here as part of what is the role of government in providing services? And you can come out in a very different place there. The problem is when you have a campaign, when you have a ballot question that's talking about tax cuts, I mean, not talking about imposing them if they pass, 2 of them, and the whole campaign is focusing on tax cuts. Politically, you get in and then you face this reality, and it is a virtual impossibility to talk about tax increases. So, and yeah, okay, you do want to take advantage of this enormous fiscal crisis to have reforms, but then you have the reality that that is only a fraction of the gap you face. And what are the consequences of that? Well, the consequences are that all of the things we say we stand for, higher education, I mean, how many times do we hear about public higher education, our workforce, and this is our great strength in this state. Now, we have great universities, private universities, but the vast majority of those people leave Massachusetts. Public higher education, they stay. And that's a critical, but we're gonna cannibalize public higher education, as an example. Aid to local communities, local schools. You can't talk about, hey, we're gonna improve schools, close the achievement gap, all the things that everybody's unanimously for, and then we take the rug out on the spending side. It doesn't compute. But that's the reality that the next governor is going to have to deal with. So I'm sorry. Thank you.